Alright, these are 7 things you should know before you buy the Canon R100. Now, I don't want to waste your time, I'm going to get right into this video, but if this does help you out, please consider dropping a like and subscribing to my channel. So number 1, the Canon R100 doesn't have a fully articulating touchscreen like almost every other Canon camera has had for the past 5 or 6 or even more years. So this camera has a fixed screen on the back here, so you can't articulate it, you can't tilt it, you can't swivel it, anything like that. It is just completely fixed on the back of the camera. And there's also no touchscreen capabilities on this camera. And so this definitely limits a ton of functions that previous Canon cameras have, as well as any higher end Canon cameras like the R50, R10, R6, and the R5. So those cameras with even just touchscreens, you can change all the different settings, go through the menus and things like that, which saves a ton of time, rather than having to select different options and scroll through the wheels and dials to change things like ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, as well as just to go through the menu. That's all stuff that's so easy on other Canon cameras with touchscreens that I really don't know why Canon took that functionality out of this camera. The only reason I can think of is because it's such a budget camera, they just couldn't afford to put in that touchscreen that they've had in all their other cameras. But that's pretty much all there is to know about the screen on this. It's just really limiting not having that fully articulating touchscreen that Canon's had in so many cameras that is just so simple to use. But that's it for the screen. Let's move on to number 2. Alright, next up, the 4K video recording options on the Canon R100 are very limited. So in 4K, you can only record in 24 frames per second, rather than up to 60 frames per second like you can do in 1080p with this camera. But also there's an additional crop on the video when you record in 4K. Now this camera already has an APS-C size sensor, which means you have a 1.6 times crop already on whatever lens you put on this camera. But with that additional crop, it makes this even more zoomed in of a camera. It makes it even more difficult to get wide angle images like for vlogging or recording yourself in a studio like what I'm doing right here. So that's really important to know if you specifically planned on picking up this camera to record video with. The 1080p video out of this camera is pretty decent, but it's 1080p going into 2024 now. It's definitely not as good as recording nice 4K video, which is the standard nowadays. And I just wouldn't recommend picking up this camera if you plan on recording 4K video. So kind of specific, it's still good for 1080p video. There's no additional crop. You can record up to 60 frames per second. Of course, with that limited fixed screen on the back, it's gonna be difficult to vlog with this because you won't be able to see yourself, or even what I'm doing right here. I have my screen flipped out so I can see myself. You won't be able to do anything like that with this camera. So really overall for video recording, it has quite a few limitations. Real quick, I have a very serious message from today's sponsor, Aura. It is constantly becoming easier and easier for anybody to find your personal information on the internet, including your full legal name, your home address, your personal email, and even your relatives. So I just searched up what my address is on Google, and literally the first result showed personal information about me as well as my old home address. But even scarier, it has my actual relatives' full names, information, and their full home addresses. Now the reason this information is accessible to almost anybody is because data brokers sell your information to robocallers, spammers, telemarketers, and really anybody else that wants to learn more about you. But that's where today's sponsor, Aura, comes in. So Aura will actually identify data brokers that are selling your personal information and automatically submit opt-out requests on your behalf. And Aura will even opt you out of junk mail and telemarketing lists as well, so you don't get all that random spam email. So you can actually use my code aura.com/foxtail to get 2 weeks of Aura for absolutely free. And you can see just how many data brokers are actually sharing your information. Now, Aura's app even features a VPN, password manager, real-time credit and identity theft monitoring, and it even protects all of your devices from malware. So Aura really has almost every internet safety tool you're ever gonna need, all in one single app. And trust me, you are gonna be shocked at how much of your personal information has been exposed, even in just that 2-week period. So once again, use my link down in the description, aura.com/foxtail, to start your 2-week trial today. All right, now let's get back to the video. All right, next up, this one also actually involves video. It's gonna be really quick, but this camera has a 30-minute recording limit. Now, this is something that almost every other mirrorless camera nowadays has removed, this 30-minute recording limit that all cameras used to have. But for some reason, the R100 still has a 30-minute recording limit. So once you get to recording for 30 minutes straight, it's just gonna automatically stop recording. There's no way to get around it. You're just gonna have to hit start record again, and you'll have that little bit of a gap no matter what. Even if you hit record right away, you know, you'll have like a 1-second gap, which for some people, for specific things, if you record tons of long events where you just wanted a really cheap budget portable camera for, that could be a deal breaker for you, so it's definitely important to know. All right, next up, RF mount lenses can be very expensive. Now there are some more budget options coming out recently, which I did make a video about a lot of the great budget options for this lens mount, which I'll link down in the description if you want to check that out. But in general, the lenses available for the Canon RF mount as of right now in late 2023 are very, very limited, and a lot of them are actually in the higher pro section. And I'm talking like $1, $2, $3, $4, even sometimes $10,000 lenses that are available for the RF mount. There's not very many lenses available under $1,000, and especially under $500. There's a very limited selection of lenses available for this mount. Now next up, this is kind of going off of that. If you didn't know, the Canon R100 is the cheapest interchangeable lens camera you can buy from any manufacturer right now, again, as of late 2023. If you want to purchase a new interchangeable lens camera to learn about lenses and shooting in manual mode and things like ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, and just learning about photography, this is the cheapest option you have for any camera manufacturer for an interchangeable lens mirrorless camera right now. And so I do think it's great that Canon released this camera in that extremely low price point area where there just isn't any other cameras from any other manufacturers right now. You know, for example, Sony is one of the most popular camera brands alongside Canon, and the cheapest interchangeable lens camera Sony makes right now is $700, which is honestly pulling up towards double the price of this Canon R100. So if you just want to learn about photography and learn about shooting in manual mode and lenses and things like that, this is the cheapest possible option right now if you plan on purchasing a camera new. All right, next up, I think this is important to know that the Canon R50, of course this one's kind of rigged out with a cage and a lens, but a standard Canon R50 is only about $200 more than the R100, and you get a ton more features out of this camera, including that amazing fully articulating touchscreen, which alone for some people could make the R50 worth the extra price versus the R100. Now, if you want to check it out, I made a pretty in-depth video going into all the differences between the R100, the R50, as well as the older Canon M50. If you're still trying to decide which camera you want to purchase, that video goes very in-depth on all the differences between these two cameras. But of course, your budget is one of the most important things when it comes to buying a camera. So if a camera is out of your budget, it's just not an option from the start. So of course, I'm not saying everybody should go purchase the R50 instead of the R100, but I do think for only $200 more, it's worth looking into the differences before deciding specifically on the R100. All right, now lastly, on the side of this camera, you have a nice USB-C port. It's really nice to see camera manufacturers adding USB-C and finally starting to switch over from micro USB ports. But what's kind of weird, on the R100, different from almost every other newer Canon camera with USB-C ports, you can't charge the battery in this camera by plugging it in with the USB-C port. You have to have an external battery charger. You have to have one of those with you at all times to be able to charge the battery in this camera, even though it has that nice USB-C port right on the side of the camera. You can only use that for transferring files from the camera. And so since most other Canon cameras and really any other camera right now that has a USB-C port can charge the battery through that port without having to bring an extra charger with you, I think that's something important just to mention, that the Canon R100 can't do that for some weird reason.